Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. I can remember the year. I honestly can't. No, not always. I can't always. In this lecture, we will be moving from the Chesapeake down here and the mid-Atlantic seaboard to New England, the English colonies in what is now the northeastern US. See Massachusetts there, Boston. Later on, we get Connecticut, Rhode Island, things like that. The celebratory version of the Pilgrims, the Mayflower, and Plymouth Rock usually says something along the lines of, the Puritans came to America seeking religious freedom. This often leads to confusion once people learn that, in fact, the first group of Puritans to settle in New England was incredibly intolerant of religious variation, even within their own group. The Puritans traveled to the New World not for a grand idea of religious freedom and tolerance. They didn't even seek religious freedom for themselves. They had been able to practice as they wished in both England and in the Netherlands. This painting from the mid-19th century, the 1850s, it is filled with symbolism and sentimentality that were quite effective in the antebellum or pre-American Civil War era. The Pilgrims are just setting off in the Mayflower. The scene seems rather short on sailors for a transatlantic journey in a matchstick boat. Maybe the sailors were allowed to come above decks once the rainbow disappeared. The Mayflower actually had 11 crew, counting the captain and the cooper. The disconnect between American mythology of Puritans and reality starts to make a bit more sense when you learn that the Puritans did not call themselves Puritans. They considered themselves to be the godly folk, and more elite individuals could be called saints. Other Christians in Europe gave the group the name Puritans because these godly folk took an extreme holier-than-thou stance. The Puritans felt that Europe had been overrun by sin and iniquity. In other words, only they, the Puritans, were pure. Everyone else was corrupt. The word purity was turned into Puritans. The first Puritans came to North America to get away from everyone else so that their own purity would not be sullied. In all fairness to the Puritans, they were not entirely incorrect about the sin and debauchery part. This on the slide is the inside of a tavern. And unlike the previous painting, this one was done in the 1630s from observation, even if the specifics of the particular image are staged. So you can see they're getting on with gambling and fighting, and he's got his trousers undone, and there's alcohol spilling, and there's someone looking in and watching them. The godly folk went to North America to get away from the sin and degeneracy of Europe. But as we have seen in earlier lectures, they arrived in a land that they considered savage and worried all the time that their exposure to savagery would be a new source of impurity. The brown chapters give you some background on European attitudes towards cleanliness and purification. The Puritans took the idea of purity and ran with it. The Plymouth Rock group of Puritans advocated not merely purity of the body, but purity of life, of mind, of worship, of soul. Unsurprisingly, they also saw themselves as the arbiters of what counted as pure. This is an image of on arrival, the two pictures on our left here, versus by the 1670s of Puritan fashion. On the left, we have the Mayflower, Winslow, and Standish, and on the right, the Freak and Padishal, born Woody images. And the point that I'm making here is things like the little tassels, which actually I made this, and with all of those knots, it takes forever to make. So there was a good deal of work put into this, including shaping the collar, but it was relatively plain. It did not take the Pilgrims more than half a century to start indulging in things like lace and colored clothing for their children. Towards the end of the last lecture, I brought up the idea that it is not only possible, but fairly common to hold two completely diametrically opposed or completely incompatible ideas or outlooks at the same time. In certain branches of psychology, some types of holding mutually exclusive ideas at the same time are described as dialectical thinking, and the psychologist generally focuses on having the person realize that a particular dialectic exists for them and then leaving it alone. Being best friends with your flatmate and still wanting to yell at them because they never, ever do any dishes, including their own, is a dialectic in this usage. You sincerely like your friend, but when you walk into the kitchen, you sort of hate them at the same time. Psychology also has the idea of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when something new coming into our brain directly conflicts with an existing belief. Cognitive dissonance tends to cause stress and anxiety. Cognitive dissonance also tends to center on closely held beliefs, ideas, or values. The Puritans who crossed the Atlantic early on did not call part of their motivation continuous cognitive dissonance. The current word meaning package would have been nonsensical to them. It didn't exist. But they did not even want to take a chance that anything might make them waver in their beliefs. And so they came to a completely new place in a relatively small group and tried to set up a new society from the ground up. If you have ever tried to pitch tents in a campsite with only 3 people, you know that things were not going to go smoothly for the Plymouth Rock Pilgrims, which is why I have called Lecture 11, Puritans and the Early Settlement of New England, Fractious, Internally Conflicted, and Litigious. Fractious means they argued with one another and everybody else. Internally conflicted, I think, is clear. Litigious means that they actually brought legal suits against one another, which is how we know a certain amount about them because those documents continue to exist. You will be even more certain that the Puritans got a bumpy start when you know that the Puritans as a group loved hierarchy and order. If someone tells you that the Puritans believed in equality, they are either misunderstanding something or they are actually thinking of the Quakers, who were a separate group. The Mayflower Pilgrims had a basic hierarchical structure in place when they set out, but they did not deal with the specifics, and they did not plan for how they might interact in a completely new space. On the slide, you have a cutaway drawing of the Mayflower, and you can see how packed in there people were. Does not make for happy spirits. So we have quite rigid people in a new and rather terrifying world trying to coordinate building a closely knit society from the ground up. And each of them is set in their beliefs and their own interpretation of what were supposedly common beliefs. Fractious is basically irritable and quarrelsome. Internal conflict for these Puritans existed both at the within community level and also within each single individual level. Being orderly, hierarchically inclined, rule-wanting folks, the Mayflower Pilgrims set up government and judiciary systems fairly quickly after their arrival in North America in 1620. Litigation is bringing a lawsuit against someone. Partly, we know a great deal about these people because they were constantly arguing and they kept records, both official and personal. Now we'll rewind to Europe and the religious conflicts that I passed over briefly in the first two lectures of this module. This will put the Puritans and the idea of religious freedom into a broader context. As with anything I give you on Europe, you do not need the details, just the big picture. We have discussed European politics a tiny bit. And I've repeated that European countries, especially in Western Europe in the early modern period, were building themselves into large nation states. Exploration and colonization for European governments was about power. European countries wanted colonies to make money. And at this point, making money meant engaging in a certain type of heavily controlled and internally competitive trade. Trade included both the idea of saleable goods and the idea of making surplus capital, which you can think about as extra wealth and money for now for our purposes. This period is often viewed as marking the beginnings of Western capitalism. You know that the charter for Virginia was held by the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was one among many joint stock companies that formed across Europe and helped to fund enlarging national governments. Even in Britain, the Virginia Company was not alone. Britain had the East India Company. That's the one that shows up in most movies and popular culture, which is what you are seeing on the slide. There were also the Hudson's Bay Company, the Muscovy Company, the South Sea Company, and more. The point of joint stock companies was that you didn't have one person who was wealthy enough to back lots of voyages that were risky. And so a number of people with a fair amount of money would get together and pool their resources so that if one ship went down, which was likely, they spread the losses around rather than having every particular person be ruined one after another. For nation states, the idea was that the more global trade you can control, the wealthier your government would become. Exploration expanded very quickly to colonialism and empire building, and this was a global endeavor. North America was not unique in being walloped by competing European colonizers. You do not need to be able to see the details here, just the sheer amount of trade routes. And unlike the early exploration routes from the beginning of class, these were busy more or less continuously and at the same times. You can also see the way that Western European empires carved up and claimed the Americas. You can see Spanish claims in the brick color, Portuguese claims in green, the French claims in pink here and here, and you can see the British claims in lavender here and here. So not just the 13 colonies, but also up in what would become Canada. There are also Dutch claims in blue. You can see it better in northern South America here, but also around here, which is why New York was originally New Amsterdam. European imperial governments expected the people who went to these colonies to be part of this big empire and capital system. So the joint stock companies had to work within the rules of their own particular government. The reasons that individuals colonized North America were infinite, but we can sort out some groups with sets of shared motivations, as well as whatever individual motivations they harbored. We've seen soldiers, missionaries, fur traders, and wannabe heads of landed estates, as well as the desperately poor and people who had no motivation to be forced to North America but were made to do so anyway. And here I'm talking about enslaved people. We touched briefly on religion in Maryland, but now we are going to do a quick trip through European religious conflict up to the 1600s. The image on the slide here is the port of Amsterdam. The things that look a bit like forests in the back here are the masts of ships, like these here, like those in the foreground. And you can just barely see the towers of a few buildings way in the background. This is the scale of trade that we are talking about here. Prior to around 1500, the church and Christianity in Western Europe were synonymous with the Roman Catholic Church. We saw with Spanish colonization in the Americas that religion was quite deliberately used alongside the military as a strategy of conquest. This on the slide is a cathedral in the north of France. These are the roofs of modern apartment buildings. I'm showing you this for a sense of the absolutely monumental scale of religion in Western Europe. Religion was about belief systems, but there was also a great deal of power and money in the hands of the church. While individuals on the ground were guided largely by doctrine and beliefs, for kings, there was more at stake. The French monarchy stayed staunchly aligned with the Catholic Church, which brings up the question, if the church had meant Catholicism, what else could a Christian monarch be starting in the 1500s? From the beginning of the 16th century, meaning the 1500s, groups of Europeans began to split away from the Catholic Church. In 1517 or 1521, we don't need to worry about that historical discussion. Martin Luther, who gives his name to the Lutheran denomination, famously critiqued the Catholic Church. This provides a symbolic starting point for the European or the Protestant Reformation. But Luther's ideas about the relationship of individuals to God and church reflected bigger shifts that were happening in Europe. You can see Martin Luther in this picture painted during his lifetime, and he is rather severe looking. The Catholic Church encompassed variability. We saw that with the Franciscans in New Mexico and the Jesuits in New France. But Catholic doctrine, rules, philosophy, and practice remained fairly cohesive, and at least at some level linked to central decision makers in the Vatican. Protestantism was not and is not a unified religion. Protestants are called that because earlier reformers protested against and wanted to reform the official church. There are many denominations lumped together under the title Protestant. They are all Christian, but sometimes they may have very little else in common. The chart here on the slide shows just a small subsection of Protestant denominations, but you can see the Protestant Reformation with the Lutherans splitting off early. And I will also draw your attention to the Anglican Church of England branch. We are about to head to that split. As ever with these background stories, they are meant to help situate America in the larger world. And to give you a sense of the big picture layer of history, you do not need to remember the details. So it's story time. You might remember Henry VIII. He came up under the discussion of codpieces, this article of clothing, as symbols of privilege and power in one of my lecture codas. He is generally remembered because he had 6 wives and he had 2 of them beheaded. So if you go to school in England, you know, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That is what happened to his 6 wives. It is his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, whom he did not behead, that we care about here. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whom you may remember as the king and queen of a unified Spain and the monarchs who funded Columbus. Catherine was betrothed to Arthur Tudor, the eldest prince of the English royal family, when she was 3 years old and he was 2. At this point, England was a bit of a backwater and not hugely powerful, but it had aspirations and potential. So Spain still valued an alliance with England, and Catherine was the youngest child. The older ones had already secured alliances through marriages, so she could kind of be shunted off on a gamble on a low power country. You will notice that European marriages had absolutely nothing to do with love and companionship. Arthur and Catherine's engagement went through a number of back and forth international treaties that I will not go into. And they were married when he was 15 years old and she was 16. The idea was that Arthur, as the heir, would inherit the throne of England in due time, and England and Spain would have both diplomatic and economic ties. Some of the marriage treaties regarded Catherine's dowry or the money paid to England by Spain as part of the marriage. But Arthur died in 1502 before becoming king, so England had to turn to the spare. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to keep their alliance with England and asked the Spanish ambassador to negotiate a marriage between Catherine and Arthur's younger brother, Prince Henry the Spare. The entire story of the intrigues and machinations that went on is fascinating, but I am going to skip over most of it and note here that a marriage between Catherine and Henry required a special dispensation from the Pope as head of the Catholic Church. This was because Catherine had been married to Henry's brother, so she was now Henry's sister. Church law did not allow a man to marry his brother's widow at that time because it was considered a type of incest. In order to get the dispensation allowing the marriage, Catherine had to testify that she and Arthur never consummated their marriage, meaning that they never had sexual intercourse. Clearly, royal sexual activity was not a private matter. Henry and Catherine come into our story for this class one more time. The couple had a daughter together, but no son. As you are aware, the law of the land in England was primogeniture, meaning that eldest sons inherited from their fathers, including inheriting the crown of England. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine for a younger woman who might be able to give him a son and secure his royal lineage. But a divorce from Catherine would have to be approved by the Pope, who refused. Henry VIII then took the monumental step of splitting England from the Catholic Church and establishing the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, with himself at the head. Now we have 3 major religious schisms in Christian Europe and lots of little ones. The Catholic Church remained the official religion in countries such as Spain and France. Reformist or Protestant splinter groups and Catholics were already fighting across Europe. This was not arguing and debating. This was violent battles and massacres type fighting. And it affected pretty much everyone in Europe from any walk of life. Now, Henry VIII had split all of England from the Catholic Church and formed the Anglican Church. On the slide here, you are seeing the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, in case you want to look up what is going on specifically here. Henry VIII switched England to Anglicanism. Henry oversaw the dissolution or the destruction of the monasteries, in which he ordered the closure of all Catholic sites, not just churches, but monasteries, priories, convents, friaries, the whole lot. Income that had gone to the Catholic Church now went to him, and he sold the land in England of many Catholic groups to fund wars for territory on the continent of Europe. Henry VIII was succeeded by his son, Edward VI. Edward only lived to rule for 6 years, but during that time, he shifted the Anglican Church toward a much more severe type of Protestantism, and this involved battles and killing people. Edward VI died very young. He was succeeded by his sister, Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and Henry, and a devout Catholic. She tried to restore Catholicism in England, and this involved battles and killing people. From here on, just assume that any major religious shift involved battles and killing people. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who backed Walter Raleigh's failed colonies in North America, succeeded her sister Mary. Elizabeth I was Protestant. She managed to hold the throne of England for a remarkably long time, but eventually died. Elizabeth I had no children, so the throne went to James I. James I was the one who had a thing about witches, especially early in his reign. But he had been baptized Catholic, brought up Protestant, and leaned himself personally toward Anglicanism. His time actually involved fewer battles and killing people, at least over religion, than previously. Now, witches, not so much. He also saw much more intensive colonization of North America. James I was succeeded by his eldest son, Charles I. Charles I is the one who granted the charter for Maryland to Lord Baltimore. He was gung-ho about North American colonization. He is also the one who lost his head to the parliamentarians. Charles I favored high Anglicanism, closer to Henry VIII's original style of Anglicanism. Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector after the execution of Charles I. You may recall that Cromwell was a staunch Puritan, like the Pilgrims who went to Plymouth. When Cromwell died, England restored the monarchy. Charles II, brother of Charles I, became king. Charles II was Protestant. His wife was Catholic. His big goal, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, was to die in bed with his head still attached to his body. Charles II tried to end religious fighting with the Declaration of Indulgence, withdrawing laws against Catholics, but he was overruled by Protestant Parliament. But these were now Anglicans, not Puritans. The Great Plague of London and the Great Fire of London happened during the reign of Charles II. Poor Charles II. He had many issues to worry about, but he did die with his head attached. This represents the leadership of England for a century. Every single one of these changes in leadership involved a change in official policy on religion, and every change in religious policy involved violence. There is one tradition in popular American history that the Pilgrims, the group of Puritans who came to North America on the Mayflower, were somehow uniquely oppressed. You are looking at a century of extreme violence and conflict over religion, of which the Puritans, and particularly the Pilgrim group who colonized New England around here, James the First, between Elizabeth and Charles. They were only one small part. The word puritanical now means someone who is exceedingly strict in moral and religious matters. That should make some sense in terms of what we have been discussing in Europe, but often people will overlay ideas about sex that actually date to later centuries onto the Puritans and assume that being strict rule followers meant that they were anti-sex or anti-sexual enjoyment. That is actually not quite the case, as we will see in a bit. Puritans believed that religious understanding must be sought by individuals who read the Bible for themselves, and Puritans rejected what they considered to be distracting luxuries, things like Christmas celebrations and the trappings of high church, as taking away from the contemplation of God. Puritans listened to sermons given by educated ministers. Some historians estimate that the average Puritan listened to over 7,000 sermons through the course of their life. Puritans also believed that at birth, God had already determined which souls were elect and which souls were damned. In theory, they believed that there was no way of knowing which kind of soul you had, nor could you change whether you were born with God's grace and would go to heaven or not. So not only were these people anxious because they might be contaminated by sin around them, they lived their entire lives worrying about whether their immortal souls were already destined for eternal hell. Like most people, they looked for reassurance, and they felt that leading a comfortable life and prospering economically might be signs of God's grace. Alternatively, idleness and immoral behavior were sure signs of damnation. In that context, it makes a bit more sense that the Puritans wanted to get away from England and other parts of Europe that were filled with bad influences that led their children into idleness and immorality. So they decided to form colonies in the Americas that could keep sin excluded. If you think about this, it is not entirely logically coherent. If the decision about the soul was made before a child's birth, then an elect soul would have God's grace regardless of its surroundings. But we have already noted that most of us are not completely consistent in the way we live our lives. So there's that. Remember that the Puritans did not call themselves that. The names Precisionists and Puritans were insults leveled at them by other English people because the godly folk, as they thought of themselves, wanted to cleanse both church and society of anything they considered dissipation and debauchery. Puritans was the name that stuck because non-Puritans were not enthusiastic about being purified. Puritans wanted to get rid of maypoles, alehouses, theaters, brothels, having fun on Sundays, and non-marital sex. Take note of the non-marital part. It matters to our topic, and we will come back to it. You saw in the set of lectures on the Chesapeake that the concepts of liberty and independence meant land ownership for most Englishmen. The Puritans went in search of what they called moral liberty, which they distinguished from natural liberty. This is different from the Chesapeake settlers. Natural liberty was acting without restraint. It was the liberty to do evil, and the Puritan leaders in particular were utterly against it. Moral liberty meant a liberty to do only that which is good, and good meant only things that would not distract the mind from the contemplation of God. So severe restraints on speech, other religions, and all kinds of personal behavior were a-okay and still included under liberty, just moral liberty. You may have heard of John Winthrop and his City Upon a Hill sermon. If not, you could Google them. Winthrop said that true freedom depended on subjection to authority. This is not what the founding fathers would think of as freedom and liberty. But for John Winthrop, otherwise, if true freedom, subjection to authority, was not followed, there would just be anarchy, and disorder was a bad thing. The first group of Puritans to head to North America, the Mayflower Pilgrims of 1620, were also the most severe and restrictive group of Puritans. They had intended to head to the Virginia colony, but got blown off course and landed at Cape Cod. This was probably just as well for them because they constantly worried about encroaching immortality and disorder. And the society I have outlined for Virginia at this time was decidedly immoral and disordered by the standards of the Mayflower Pilgrims. For the Puritans, the family was the foundation of strong moral communities, and unmarried adults were a threat to social order, in part because they tended to get horny and fall into sin. You heard that correctly, at least if you interpreted my words to mean that unmarried adults of both sexes, but especially women, were subject to the itchings of lust if they had no partner to satisfy them on a regular basis. We will revisit the explanation later in the lecture. In 1629, once the Pilgrims gained a foothold in North America, a group of London merchants formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. This was quite different from the Virginia Company in many ways. The Massachusetts Bay Company was not looking for extreme wealth for a few individuals. They hoped to further the Puritan cause, and although they did want to turn a profit, it was meant to keep the company going and members prosperous, not to make tons of money, which the Puritans believed led to vanity and idleness and many other bad things. The map on the left shows European claims in and around the Massachusetts colony. The map on the right is a distribution of Native Americans in the region when the English arrived. The thing in the middle is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company. The Native American on the seal is shown with a speech bubble that says, "Come over and help us." We can see the differences between Virginia and Massachusetts on these ship manifests or lists of passengers, both of them from 1634. The one on the left from Virginia, the one on the right says bound for New England, but at the time it was Massachusetts. I know that they are small, but I will explain what is on them. On the left is the ship that's going to Virginia. They are mostly men, the entire first column and most of the second, and mostly young, 19, 20, 16, 19, 16. There are a few folks who are long in the tooth, but relatively few. And most of these are traveling as individuals. They're traveling alone. It's just their name that's listed. On the right is a ship going to Massachusetts. I will show you a close-up of parts of this, but note that this manifest, this list of passengers, is not split by gender or anything else. These people are a single group. If we enlarge parts of the Massachusetts manifest, these people are grouped by families or households, and these include multiple generations as well as encompassing servants. They are of all ages and have a far better balance of men and women than the Chesapeake colonies, although initially slightly skewed towards men. If we look at the Hall family here, this is the first family on the manifest, and that's not an accident. Joseph Hall, the head of the family, is a minister. He's 40 years old. Agnes Hall is his wife. She's 25 years. Now we can figure out that she is probably his second wife, because Joan Hall, his daughter, is 15 years, and Puritans did not marry and have children at 10 years old. Joseph Hall also has a son, 13 years, probably by his first wife. Tristram, 11 years. Elizabeth, 7 years. Temperance, 9 years. Grisel, 5 years. Dorothy, this should be Hall, and this is a misprint on the original manifest. 3 years. So by this time, Dorothy may actually be Agnes's daughter. Judith French is his servant, only 20 years old. John Wood, also his servant, only 20 years old. And Robert Dabin, his servant, 28 years old. These all would have lived in the same home. If we look over here at John Upham, he is a husbandman and he's 35. A husbandman is a farmer that focuses on animals. With him in his family is Joan Martin, different last name. She's 44. Chances are good that this is John's sister who has been widowed after marrying a Mr. Martin. Elizabeth Upham, it doesn't say, but she is probably John's wife. John Upham Jr., 7, Sarah Upham, 26. Now, she may be Elizabeth's sister, or she may be John's sister. She's definitely not their child. William Green, 12, probably a servant with a different last name here, since men were not under the rules of covenant, and he would not have changed his name, so his last name is actually Green. Nathaniel Upham, 5, Elizabeth Upham, 3, and then we have another family, Dorset Richard Wade of Simstley. So he's actually still identifying with the town in England that he came from. He's a cooper, it means he made barrels, and he is 60 years old. His wife is Elizabeth, and she's 60-something. She probably did not know her birthday. And then we go through children and servants. To go back to Joseph Hall, also identified by his origin in England, the minister is listed first. This was not random. It reflected the type of hierarchy that these Puritans envisioned. For the Puritans, gender, sex, and the family were the basic organizing principle of society, but not in all of the ways that tend to show up in movies and the popular imagination. The family was considered a little church and a little commonwealth. A father, assuming that the family still had a living father, was the head of the household. This meant that the father or father figure held responsibility for the souls of his dependents, wife, children, and servants, which again is not entirely consistent with the idea of predestination, but there we are. The role of the father, head of the household to dependents, was the model for all social relations more broadly. In theory, the structure was repeated in the relationship of minister to congregants and magistrate to subject. Notice that there are two power structures there, religious and political. Being entwined does not assure agreement. This system was also meant to reflect the relationship of God to humanity. The system sounds ever so neat and tidy until you start digging into actual human beings. I put this picture partly to give you the idea of just how extended a Puritan family could be, and also because, quite honestly, many of these people looked happy because they were happy with one another, even if life was hard. In terms of gender, sex, power dynamics were situational, meaning that they were fluid up to a point, and we will get to that. Power dynamics were also always gendered, but that did not mean that women were drudges. Authority in any given situation was male, subordination would be female. In the words of one historian, Godbeer, men's and women's roles were multifaceted in ways that complicated both gender identity and social prerogative. A worthy matron could simultaneously be wife, mother, household mistress, neighbor, and member of the Christian community. In some interactions, she was expected to take the father role and exercise a wisely awful, that's a quote, authority. In others, she was required to defer obediently. Some hierarchical relationships were clear, but many were not. What about your neighbor? What to do in situations with multiple people present and multiple dynamics of authority at play? Moreover, as I hinted earlier, not every household had a male-bodied, as judged by the community, father-husband around. Death was not unfamiliar to anyone, nor was debilitating illness or injury, and travel took incredibly long amounts of time. What if, for any of these reasons, a husband could not fulfill his role? It happened often enough that there was a system in place. His wife became a deputy husband. She was expected to fulfill her husband's duties as household head. Neighbors and business associates were expected to relate to her as they would to the man whose place she filled. There could be, and were, complications in spiritual relationships as well. The assumption underlying any interaction was not just that a hierarchy existed, but that hierarchy was specifically conceived of as a wife-husband relationship in all cases and levels. Bride, wife to husband, head of household. Congregant, that's the person who goes to a church, was the wife to the minister, who was the husband, even if the congregants were male. Subject, male and female, wife to the magistrate, the husband, and soul, the wife, the bride wife to God, the husband father. Souls were all equally female before God. All household members could form a direct connection to God through prayer. So there were no priests. Ministers served a different role. But at the same time, the head of the household mediated between God and his dependents. Also, if the father husband were not a minister, then the minister mediated between God and the husband father and all of the husband father's dependents. What were those dependents to do if the minister and father husband disagreed on something? There is, of course, more, but I'd like to return to this last one, the soul as the wife or bride to God. The idea of the soul as the wife or bride to God might seem familiar to you from our discussion of Spanish Franciscans. And there are similarities. The personal relationship of the soul to God was sometimes described in very similar erotic terms. But, and this is a substantial difference, and one that is unfamiliar to most people when they think of Puritans or really any Anglophone husband-wife pairing. The Franciscans that we looked at were ascetics. For them, any pleasure of the flesh was to be subdued, had to be subdued. Puritans were not ascetics. Enjoying anything within certain boundaries was not only fine, but expected. The limits were defined in terms of what would be in the service of God. So, Puritans couldn't lay out an entire Louis XIV banquet. That would represent excess and gluttony. But Puritans were expected to prepare the food they did have in ways that gave them pleasure. This would put both food and body in the service of God. Spoiler to the next section, marriage and sex within marriage were in the service of God for both participants. Unlike elite marriages in England, which we've seen were a matter of diplomatic arrangements, or marriages in Virginia, for which the Virginia Company literally had to advertise in England for women willing to go to the Chesapeake and marry men they had never met, the ideal Puritan marriage was based on reciprocal affection and companionship. All people were vulnerable to wandering off the correct path. Both partners were there to help one another make certain that both of their souls would be pleasing to God. Again, if that sounds rather more like salvation by works rather than grace, but moving on. Men had legal supremacy in their household, but reality was extremely variable, especially when people started moving to the hinterlands away from the constantly watchful eyes of neighbors, ministers, and everyone else. Privacy was not really a thing generally. Young people chose their own partners, usually because they liked them, although I'm certain that they took social, familial, and financial factors into account, just as most of us do now. Puritans generally married the first time in their 20s, both men and women. Sex outside of marriage was prohibited, but people were supposed to marry someone they got on with, and they were supposed to enjoy sexual intercourse with that person. Remember also that in the early modern construction of reproduction, both partners had to achieve orgasm for conception to occur. Puritans were most definitely not anti-sex as long as it was within marriage. For Puritans, God had ordained sexual intercourse as the only way to have children, and the Puritans wanted children. But a married couple had to enjoy sex together for that to happen. So practicing within marriage was advisable. The concept of marital sexual intercourse went beyond reproduction, however. The sexual act or conjugal union was supposed to literally embody the love that should unite the married couple. This was such a self-evident truth that either partner could legally sue for divorce on the grounds that the other refused them sexual intercourse. Again, that was either partner, wife included. And we know this because women did sue for and were granted divorce on these grounds. Remember the whole litigious and keeping good records from the beginning of lecture? James Maddock was thrown out of his congregation because he, quote, denied conjugal fellowship unto his wife for the space of 2 years together. John Williams was subjected to a disciplinary hearing for a number of abuses, and, quote, in special his sequestration of himself from the marriage bed. One case chastised the man for, quote, refusing to perform marriage duty towards her according to the law of God and man. There's more, but I suspect you get the point. And again, note that things we consider private with a particular set of expectations is not the same as Puritan expectations of privacy. I have this image because I just love how happy these two seem together with one another. This is probably a good time to point out that the Puritan household was most emphatically not the 1950s version of a nuclear family, even if family constructions in both were centered on the husband-wife pair bond. A Puritan family might include 3 generations, a grandparent or two, the married couple, and children, but it was also more complicated than that. The household often included extra people to help out. Young people were essential to both men's and women's farming tasks. Teenagers might live as servants in someone else's household for a period before they got married. They would learn any particular skills that people in that household knew. The Puritans also had indentured servants who were considered part of the household. Although, as you may imagine, they were sometimes viewed with suspicion if they had come directly from England, not with the family, as who knows what those people had been exposed to before they left England. Finally, when it came to household formation, it was not uncommon for people to be widowed and to remarry. People often chose a second or third spouse who was similar in age, but there was nothing odd about having a somewhat younger partner. This meant that families could combine the offspring of several different marriages into one household, including offspring for whom both of the original parents were dead. Houses, especially in the early years of the very strict Puritans, were small and children were many. Women usually had around 7 children over the course of their reproductive life, although all of them rarely lived, which was part of the point of having many. Children were not sheltered from nor ignorant of sex, meaning sexual intercourse. A house might only have 1 or 2 rooms that the whole family shared. These people were also people who practiced animal husbandry, meaning that they bred livestock. It was not as if a married couple staged public performances. People certainly tried to be discreet, but more than that was impossible. We know this because fornication, sex outside of marriage, was illegal, and so it shows up in judicial records. Sometimes everyone would very carefully not know or notice about a certain connection. Complaints were usually filed by aggrieved neighbors, and the higher your status, the less inclined your neighbors were to bring suit, and the less inclined the court would be to accept a complaint filed against you. Puritans were big on rules and hierarchy, but some much more so than others. And rules and hierarchy were not always compatible with one another. Also, not everyone defined fornication, sex outside of marriage, exactly the same way. In English law, and remember these people were English, a couple could become married by making a commitment to one another. And remember, for the Puritans, these marriages ideally were based on mutual companionship and affection. Couples who declared themselves husband and wife had a union that they and those around them considered legally binding. As the Puritan population grew, household farms became more spread out. And unlike Virginia, the nearly even sex ratio and relatively healthful climate meant that the Puritans in North America experienced quick natural increase. A couple might have to wait for a traveling clergyman to come and formalize their union. Once a couple had committed to one another and told friends and neighbors, they were considered married, quote, but for the ceremony. This meant that when it did come to the ceremony, the bride might well already be pregnant. The woman in the image on the slide is probably not pregnant, but the style of clothing makes it impossible to tell. The fact that we have so many legal records for the Puritans leaves us vulnerable to the idea that Puritan marriages were largely unhappy. Only unhappy people file complaints against one another or sue for divorce. Our view tends to become skewed by our sources as well as by our own context now. Fortunately, Puritans wrote love letters to one another, deeply passionate love letters. Despite the bickering and legal complaints and high levels of anxiety among the Puritans, overall, most marriages were companionate, and most couples really were devoted to one another. The biggest problem was that your partner might die before you, or you might die and leave your partner. Puritan women were absolutely necessary to the success of Puritan households and Puritan communities. Women were not considered delicate flowers who stayed indoors, making the home a pleasant place for the husband. That sort of ideal womanhood would not be a thing until the Enlightenment and not fully developed until the 19th century. Think Victorians. Puritan women kept the household garden, which grew much of the produce a family needed. Women kept domestic animals and turned those animals into meat. Women kept chickens and cows. They would gather eggs and milk, turning the latter into cream and butter. Extra produce and dairy products were sold at market, and women handled the household finances and purchases. This on the slide is clearly a reenactor, but it is to the point. Women weren't weak. They carried firewood, they carried water long distances sometimes. Women also made beer. If you don't know already, early modern English people drank small beer in addition to water. Small beer could be especially useful when doing heavy labor away from home because it supplied both fluid and calories, kind of like liquid bread. We've seen already that women could stand in as deputy husbands, and in practice, women took over a number of roles that were categorized as head of the household duties because life took quite a bit of effort to be maintained. Women were important economic and religious actors in their own right, although there were certain limits placed upon them. In Puritan doctrine, women were deemed the spiritual equals of men. In the context of Puritan belief, this meant that women must be educated because they would need to read and consider the Bible for themselves. They could also hold meetings to discuss interpretations of the Bible. Going back to our theme of conflicting ideas, the overarching social dogma was women were subservient to men, but they were also the spiritual equals of men. There were those Puritan women who used that contradiction to threaten the power of male ministers. The most famous of these is probably Anne Hutchinson, who went on to contribute to the founding of Rhode Island after being banished from Massachusetts. Ostensibly, she was banished for heresy. But even at the time, it was also very behind the scenes known that the reason she was banished was that she threatened the power of male ministers. This suggests that for men with power in the Puritan colony, there were limits to spiritual equality and an individual's right to define their relationship with God. And that limit was basically when the male ministers or government figures' own power was threatened. I know that I sound a bit flip here, but these sorts of debates emerged in and from the inconsistencies inherent in Puritan social and religious organization. And this theme of conflict over inconsistency will be a theme going on in the class. Eventually, Hutchinson and most of her family were killed by the Sewanee group of Native Americans for encroachment on their land in the area that is now the Bronx in New York City. Although you can see from the chart on the slide that 4 of her 15 children survived, giving rise to people you might recognize now. And we will look at the direction that our anxious Puritans took in the next lecture. Key points to Lecture 11. Both the New England, think Massachusetts as an example, and the Chesapeake, think Virginia and Maryland as examples, both were settled by English colonists in the 17th century, the 1600s, but they took shape in very different directions. During the Protestant Reformation in Europe, a number of different Protestant groups split away from the Catholic Church. This process was violent for a century. Every change in leadership in England during the 17th century also involved a change in the official religion and violence, lots of violence. The Puritans came seeking religious purity for themselves. They did not welcome religious tolerance. Each person was supposed to read the Bible themselves. This meant that there was a strong emphasis among the Puritans on education for all sexes. The Puritans considered moral liberty the right to elect their own leaders and form their own relationship with God to do good. They did not favor freedom to practice any religion but their own, and they argued among themselves about the correct way to practice that. Puritan society was based on the patriarchal family. Families were usually multi-generational extended households. The ideal marriage was a companionate partnership, and couples chose one another. Children were important, and people had lots of them. The Puritans were not anti-sexual enjoyment as long as sex was contained within marriage. I am closing out this lecture with a happy Puritan couple. So much of history involves discovering that people were even more horrible than you initially thought. To discover times when people were happier and more loving than expected is a rare treat.